Hello, Sambazaji. This is Sambaza with the Sambaza podcast, and this is another week, 3 weeks down. I don't know what to say. I really appreciate all the engagement that I've received from all the podcasters that I've highlighted. I do want to say thank you to all those who responded and said kudos, and I want to thank those new relationships that we have formed over these couple of weeks. However, I want to go back, but before we start, I missed out on one particular show last week when I was doing a recap. This was Our Food Stories from Uganda. They were part of the last week's episode, which I failed to mention. So, Our Food Stories from Uganda. It's a Uganda kitchen story. It talks about omugoyo, the foods that are there, and this is a podcast that really is great in a sense, where they talk about foodstuffs that have been passed on through our families. One thing I like about the host is that instead of them being in the show, they bring in the guests. So they're actually bringing the guests to become podcasters themselves. So it's like a guesting podcast. A nice podcast for Sambazaji you want to go listen to. For those who are from Uganda, this is one of those stories that you could end up looking at the foods. I'll talk about this when I sum up the rest of the podcast. So back to my weekly review of the podcast. I'll read them out. We did We Three Queens. They have 3 hosts, and shout outs to them. Great podcast. Africana Woman by Chulu. Congo Kid, Life Stories. Now this is an interesting podcast. We'll talk about it. Sound of Accra. Two Broke Twimbos. My guys. What's Going On Africa? And The Stories I Tell. This is by Tarira Makina. Alright, let's start off with the first one. We Three Queens of Africa. We Three Queens of Africa is a great podcast, and I like their podcast. Like I said, I found them on TikTok and then got wind of it that they do have shows on Spotify and Apple. So that's where I went to see them. In other places you can listen to wherever you listen to podcast episodes. So I was there. I listened to their podcast. Great podcast, great team, and very energetic. Like I said before, if you listen to my review, they transcend everywhere, depending on whichever sphere of life you're in, whether you're old, young. They make it great. Now with the younger hosts that they have now, it makes the dimension great because you are able to listen and relate to all that is being talked about. Thank you for that. Africana Woman. Now what can I say about Chulu? This was great. Great friend, great podcaster. She's created a network in Zambia, Z-Pod Hub, I think that's what it is, and she's flying out there. If you listen to my podcast episode I had with her, she is doing great things. She's a diasporan. Like I said, what more is there to say about Chulu? She is a great soul, great person, and I thank the Zambians for making me meet her and have a chat with her. Next one is Life Stories of a Congo Kid. This is a Caucasian guy who lived in the 70s, and he's about 60 now. Ask me why. Well, I was trying to get in touch with him, tell him that I posted his video for the review and what I thought about it, because some people aren't found in socials. Well, I went around and found him, and he was on LinkedIn, and let me tell you, dude is balling. He is, yes, up there. And I couldn't send him a message on LinkedIn because I don't have the premium outlet. But if you ever get this message, Mr. Jeffrey, all his names are there, but I'll say Jeff, aka Congo Kid. I love your podcast. The three culture kids. That's the one. I liked so much. Even the hunting in Congo was great. You make us realize that you can still look at a podcast from a different perspective and make it relevant. And you have made it to actually step back and say, you know what, a podcast can be looked at in three different ways. There's somebody else from the outside, there's somebody else from the inside, and then somebody in between to kind of verify the not verify the podcast, but kind of like look and see how the podcast is viewed in three different ways because of the differences, right? You live there, you moved out, and then you somebody else was there, still lives there probably. But these are what I think are podcasts that we need to see. I appreciate you sharing that with us about your life and bringing other people to share on that podcast. I'm hoping for another season loading and to hear more stories from Congo. They bring a different breath of fresh air to African podcasters. I want to thank you for that. Sound of Accra, radio station, and then they added their stuff onto a podcast. And what they did was they made this podcast really interesting. Now, even though the headlines sometimes don't match with the stories, I think it's just a technical difficulty. I love the stories. I listened to a couple of them, and I like the idea that, and people should probably do that. Take a radio station, move it over, and have it listened to on a podcast. Now, this is a diasporan podcast as well because the people sound like they were British and then brought their stuff over to Ghana. That's where they're from, Ghana, and I like the podcast and what they brought about on the podcast. Got that radio feel too. What's going on, Africa? This is also a diasporan podcast. It's by two ladies. One is from the Caribbean and one is from Ghana or Africa. But what I like about this podcast is it explores now the Caribbean aspect and the African continent. Because remember, there's that transatlantic slavery that happened, and maybe that's what they were thinking of. I don't know. My ideas, right? Great podcast, great hosts. Listened to one show, and it was talking about this girl who had experiences, some traumatic experiences. Then she ended up creating or writing 4 books in her life. Nice engagement that was there. I'm still listening to more of them. Once I finish this 30, I think I have a whole lot of podcasts to listen to. Let me tell you, it's been fun. So, what's going on? Africa is another podcast. The Stories I Tell. This is by Tarira Makina. Tarira, your blog, transferring it over to a podcast, awesome idea. Like you said, you wanted people to get a visual, not a visual, but a hearing part. There's a hearing, and then you create that. So they're reading your blog. They can relate to what you're saying on your audio podcast, so they can hear your voice, and when you're writing into it, they can interpret it. Remember when I said I was listening to We the Queens of Africa when they were talking because of their TikTok, and I was trying to listen to their audio, and each time I kept on looking to see where exactly they were, because I'm still used to their TikToks, and just by going to the audio kind of threw me off a little bit. So I think that's the idea you have in mind, which is a great idea. Anybody else who has a blog can do this, and it's quite fine. So let's go down the line. We Three Queens is from Kenya, and it's mixed. Kenya, I think Malawi, and the other lady I think is from Uganda. Africana Woman, this is Chuli's from Zambia. Congo Kid, he's a Caucasian, but he was in Congo, and well, I'll give you Congo. Sound of Accra, that's for Ghana. Two Broke Twimbos, hey, that's from Zimbabwe. Hey, this is a nice podcast, if I may say so myself. What's going on in Africa? Ghana. The Stories I Tell, Zimbabwe. So, all in all, I say these are some of the great podcasts. I'm looking forward to next week, this being the last week of the podcasts, and we'll have another conversation, and I do a recap of only the week that I have looked into. Then maybe finally I may create another episode. Who knows? You tell me, where we'll discuss all these podcasts that we have talked about. And with that, Wasambazaji, I bid you farewell. Till next week, when I do a recap of all the shows that I've watched on the last week by Wasambazaji. So even though the headlines don't match, excuse me, and